Hi, today we're going to do a overview of the Little Ice Age and the impacts that it has. And they're really broad and far reaching um, because not only are we talking about the entire world, but we're also talking about two kind of spanning a really long time period with two specific points that we're going to focus on. So this is just a general overview. I'm just going to explain some of the theories about the causes and just kind of give a quick overview of some of the impacts. And then there's lots of linked resources that you can find in the slides themselves, and you can look at those on your own. Okay, so let's start with, first of all, what is a little ice age? So this is the typical name that you're going to find for it, the LIA, Little Ice Age, but it's not a great name because it's definitely Eurocentric. It looks at it, or it reflects the changes that happen mostly in Europe. So that gets a little bit confusing because most of the world that we're talking about, when we think about the Little Ice Age, we're not really talking about ice as in like the expansion of glaciers and extremely long winters and things like that. So we're mostly going to look actually at drought as one of the major impacts globally of the Little Ice Age. So we could call this like long-term climate change. It's not as catchy as the Little Ice Age, but that would be maybe a little bit more of an accurate reflection, right? So it's long-term climate change, and then we are going to focus on these two periods that happen here. Okay, but I want to go back to this first slide. When we're thinking about the Little Ice Age, one of the things to keep in mind is that you have really favorable conditions for humans during what's called the medieval warm period. So that's sort of the middle ages for many parts of the world. And that really starts to change somewhere around the 12th century. I mean, technically, you could say the Little Ice Age really begins as early as 1000 CE, but we're not going to see big impacts until we get to the two nadir points. So that's roughly the 14th century and then the 17th century. So again, this is a reversal of warming trends. And so that's a kind of helpful way to think about that in terms of, why is this different? Why is this impactful? So in other words, humans had favorable conditions, and then that really starts to change during this time period. So here is another chart. This one looks at reconstructed temperatures. I think what's really significant is to point out here is that we're talking about changes in temperatures of a couple degrees globally. So the averages are of a couple of years, a couple of degrees, and then that is causing devastation globally, right? So when we think about current climate change, yeah, I mean, that should freak us out because we're talking about projected temperature changes that are way more than 1 or 2 degrees in the next coming decades. So definitely, we can learn from the Little Ice Age and should learn that that climate change is incredibly impactful to humans and um, has caused the collapse of countless empires in global history. So it's something to keep our eye on and understand the lessons from. Here is a resource that you can, oh, sorry, let me go back to my nadir point. So nadir means low point. So we have two specific low points. One is worse than the other, and we're going to talk about the likely causes of that. So as I said, we've got, kind of the worst periods are roughly around the 1300s and then roughly around the 1600s. So that would be the 14th and the 17th centuries. Those aren't like perfect, obviously like history doesn't fall into like neatly contained packages. So they'll kind of span those two time periods, centuries roughly, with a little bit before, a little bit after for each one. But you can definitely see the temperature dips happen during those two time periods. So the records are very clear in terms of thinking about the decline or the nadir points during those two rough century periods. Okay, let's talk about causes. So what caused a little ice age? In scientific terms, probably a shit ton of different things. So one of the big debates is, to what extent did humans cause this, right? So we know that we're living in an age of climate change currently, and there is scientific consensus that humans caused the current um, climate change, to the extent that we even call it something totally different in history, in Earth history. So the current stage that we're living in now is known as the Anthropocene, meaning that it's human caused entirely global climate change. So global climate change is normal in terms of, like, if we're looking at the scope of thousands or millions of years of history, like the Earth has shifted in terms of its climate many, many times, right? But certainly humans can impact, accelerate a natural process, or even cause a brand new one, which is really the situation that we're looking at now. But let's think about what caused a little ice age. Did humans possibly cause it? Well, it looks like you could argue they did, in terms of globalization and the spread of diseases and the wiping out of diseases that was caused by. So it's much more of an indirect cause, right, than what we're thinking about in terms of climate change now and global warming. Um, but it looked like the impact of humans was that anytime there was a huge depopulation, and that's primarily only caused by diseases in human history, if we're thinking about like global events of depopulation. So in this time period, what we can actually point to, three epidemic eras. And then if you chart that along with CO2 in the in ice cores, we can also look at tree rings, which is called dendrochronology. That's the study of tree rings, and that tells us quite a bit about what's happening in the climate. Those are the two main sources of looking at the records in terms of temperature changes and also in terms of CO2. Okay, so CO2 uptake happens through trees, right? So trees absorb CO2. CO2 has a warming effect, right? So that's our problem currently, is way too much CO2 caused by greenhouse gases and other sources that are human related. And that CO2 too much in the atmosphere is causing a warming effect. So this is the opposite. So when a whole bunch of humans die at the same time, what happens is the forests, the plants, Mother Nature starts to reclaim lost territory, right? So in other words, when agriculture collapses, trees begin to regrow. And when there's not enough humans to cut down all the trees, forests begin to replenish. And it looks like that kind of massed forest regrowth correlates exactly with depopulation eras, right? So we have the Justinian plague, which happened in the 500s to 600s, and that correlates with ice core decline in CO2. And then even more clearly, so then we see CO2 levels rise after that during that medieval warming period that I talked about. And that's kind of the sweet spot where things were warm enough for favorable agriculture conditions, and then populations exploded during that time period. And then we have the Black Death. The chart here says it killed 25 to 40% of Europeans, and that's true across Eurasia. So all of Eurasia, we will see. I mean, I think that the average is considered to be about 30% of the total population, where the Black Death spread, which was Afro-Eurasia, right? Because that was one interconnected world. We have the Mongols to thank for creating a massive interconnected trade sector, particularly overland trade, and making it much easier to trade and expand those networks. Those networks existed before, it's just that the Mongol Empire facilitated them. So, and then lastly, we have a even greater depopulation which correlates with an even greater decline in terms of the ice core numbers. And 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 that's again CO2 records, and that correlates with the Europeans arriving in the Americas. So Europeans arrived in the Americas, brought just a massive load of epidemic germs that hadn't existed in the Americas, that peoples of the Americas had no immunities to whatsoever because they had no exposure to them previously. Those things hit all at once, particularly smallpox, but also a whole bunch of other things: typhoid, cholera, influenza. And the combined toll of those diseases is just staggering. I mean, within 50 years, we're talking about a 90 to 95% population loss. So the Americas drops from, 50 million people across the two continents, and then 90 to 95% of them are dead within 50 years. And some of that's also because of conquest, enslavement, um, and those kinds of factors, but most of it is from diseases. So we can see a huge correlation here. So decrease in CO2 has a cooling effect, and it also changes the ocean currents, which means that it's going to impact the flow of rainfall. And that's something we're going to look at with the droughts. But we have these are two different, we're not going to get too much into the oceanography and the, what is the study of weather, meteorology, of this process, but you have oscillation systems globally. Those are weather patterns that move precipitation mostly, right? So you all know about the El Nino weather patterns that are caused by that oscillation system across the Pacific. So when California, for example, gets a La Nina, that's an El Nino system that's bringing us more rain, and that means drought in other places, right? So those kinds of changes in oscillation are going to provide different impacts depending on where you're talking about in the world, right? And so it's always like good news and bad news, because it's usually better in some places and then worse in others. Similarly, the North Atlantic oscillation system operates in terms of moving different weather patterns and precipitation levels to different areas. Okay, and then we also want to think about this. There's an overall system here that we can see that is a major cause. There's different theories about why this happened. It definitely could be because of that increase in CO2 during the medieval period caused changes to the ocean conveyor system. So this is a map of what's called thermohaline circulation. So this is the ocean conveyor system, and we tend to think about all the oceans like Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. We tend to think of those as like separate oceans, but obviously like they're all connected, right? So you do have one massive circulation system that is completely global, that runs through all of the oceans, and it affects currents. So when we're talking about circulation, we're actually talking about ocean density. So the warm cycle may have dumped fresh water into the ocean, right, because of the melting of glaciers and ice. And that's exactly what we're dealing with right now in our current global climate change. So let me move this up a little bit, right? So you have the blue paths that represent the deep water currents here. The red paths represent the surface currents. And so the density of the ocean is changed depending on the warming or cooling trends, and then that changes the overall currents. So here are some articles that talk about thermohaline circulation as a direct cause of the little ice age. Okay, I gave you three different articles that you can look at for that causal factor. Here's one more chart just showing that ocean conveyor belt or thermohaline circulation. Okay, this cause is very hotly debated. It used to really be seen as one of the primary causes, but in more recent years, more scholars are saying they don't think that this was as relevant at all. But anyway, I have some articles that you can look at to kind of read the debate a little bit more for yourself. But definitely, sunspots are something humans have no control over. And it does look like, so sunspots are like hot spots in the sun, and that reflects more radiant heat particles that hit the Earth's surface. And so hypothetically, more sunspots could cause a warming effect, and then less sunspots could cause a cooling effect. So that's definitely one of the hypotheticals that is part of the total causal factors, even though it's hotly debated. Volcanoes is another impact. Okay, this is another one where humans really have no impact over it. This is not human caused. We can't control yet. We can't control volcanic eruptions, but both of the nadir points do seem to correlate with volcanoes. So that might be an additional factor. It's probably not the only factor, but it's definitely significant. I mean, it's possible that this is the main factor for at least the two nadir points. It's not going to be the overall cause, but it could be a nadir cause. So there was a series of eruptions that happened in Indonesia during the 13th century, so that would correlate with the first nadir. And then there was eruptions that happened also during the overlapping with the second nadir point. And so, for example, there was a recent book that came out. I think I have this on a slide somewhere here. That in the early 19th century, there was a year without summer, meaning that crops completely failed, and it was down to the Krakatoa explosion that happened. I have some articles about this you can look at. The extreme weather that was caused because of the 1816 volcanic eruption, what we call a mega eruption, in Krakatoa here in Indonesia. There's an image. So why do volcanoes matter? Well, especially mega eruptions. In fact, in History 3, we look at the Toba catastrophe, which was such a huge mega explosion that happened also in Indonesia, that it may have even wiped out the majority of humans. So volcanic eruptions can be very serious because they spew particles into the air, way up into the atmosphere, and then they stay there and they float. And those particles can actually block the sunlight. And so, of course, that blocking the sunlight is going to have massive implications in terms of human, animal, and plant life across the planet. And obviously, less sunlight is going to affect the overall temperatures. It's going to affect the ability of precipitation to gather. So there's a lot of effects that come from volcanic eruptions. You can check out these studies, which will tell you more. Here is an optional video that just looks at like climate change denial and how does the little ice age fit into that. So you can check that out as an optional source. Okay, I'm going to look at just a quick overview now that we've looked at the causal factors or potential theories. I want to look a little bit at the impacts that we can point to, right? So it's interesting because the little ice age now is believed by historians to cause so much stuff that happened, right? But this has only been studied in the last like 20 years. So many of these studies are super recent and haven't even made it into like, popular consciousness. And so environmental history, I think, is a very, very important and very kind of fledgling, emergent sub-study of global history. And nothing could be really, I think, more significant than understanding the way that humans are impacted by the environment and by shifts in climate change, and other kind of overarching, these are sort of background, right? They're like, these are happening in the background. And so it took scholars to say, hey, wait a second, all these empires collapse at the same time. Could that be related? Yes, it definitely could be related. So these ones are more relevant for History 3. So I'm just going to give a quick overview here. So we definitely know that during the warm period was the height of the Viking or Nordic exploratory voyages and networks that the Vikings established as they went out to Greenland and then made it all the way out to North America and the borders of what is today Canada. So it looks very, we see that you can really see the correlation here with the exact same chart I showed you before. This is the Vikings. So the height of that comes around the 1000s, and that's just when the climate change is going to start to kick in. So that's the height of the warm period beginning to then decline. And we see that by 1350, so that's the 14th century, yet again, the 14th century is our first major nadir point, and this is when the Vikings will totally abandon the settlements that they established in Canada and Greenland. So that network will collapse. And why is that significant? It's super significant when we're thinking about the history of the Americas, because had that network not collapsed, the conquest of the Americas would in the 1500s, aka like the Columbian Exchange, that wouldn't have happened in the same way because that network would have existed. People in the Americas would have been privy to the same spread of diseases, the Black Death, smallpox, the exchange of animals would have happened much, much earlier. So the entire history of the Americas would have been significantly altered had the Norse network not collapsed and ended, because that left the Americas in isolation from the other hemisphere. And then when Europeans bring all their diseases at once, right? Catastrophic, 90% dead to population of the Americas, right? So that's a huge impact if we're thinking, and it's just like, it's just happenstance, right? It's, so much of what happens in history is basically accident, meaning it's not caused by like, a single human's decision or even like a human society's choices, but all of these kind of, again, background factors. So here's some sources for the Little Ice Age and the Vikings and how that happened and why that's important. In Europe, we have what's called the 14th century crisis, and it's just like death and destruction. You've got the coldest winters, 4 coldest winters in 1,000 years that happen. You have a collapse of agriculture. We're going to see that, as harvests decline, warfare will accelerate. People got desperate. So we're going to see this happen really kind of in 2 periods in European history, where it's just like death and destruction for a whole century. But again, that decline, that dip in temperatures is certainly a big part of that, of understanding that background. In the 13th and 14th centuries, we're also going to see massive collapses of empires around the world. So for example, when Europeans arrive in North America, there are no, it just so happens that by that point, there are no big urban cities, but there were just a century earlier. But it looks like all of them collapsed during that first nadir point and had not recovered or reestablished when Europeans arrived and spread all these diseases. So North America had no big cities in the 1500s when Europeans first showed up in the Americas, but they did in the 13th and 14th centuries. So for example, we have the Pueblo empires. So that would be, Chaco Canyon and other sites in the American Southwest, multiple huge urban centers. We also have Cahokia City, which was the largest city in North America. This is in present day Missouri. It's actually just outside of St. Louis. Humans settled there and built cities for a reason, access to the river and other riverine, kind of trade opportunities with the Mississippi River. So the Mississippian culture collapsed during this time period, again, very likely to be because of climate change. We also know that the first nadir definitively caused some mega droughts. Mega droughts are defined by any drought that lasts for more than 50 years. Probably that's also happening in Cahokia. Probably that also happened in Chaco Canyon. Those are like really emergent scientific studies. We now know that the Khmer Empire, which was, it's in modern day Cambodia, and there's massive urban city Angkor, which was the capital of the Khmer Empire. That was the biggest city that in that during that century. So at the height of the Khmer Empire, more than 1 million people living in the region. And that, again, really emergent studies on that. I mean, we didn't even discover that how big the Khmer Empire actually was until it actually took NASA satellite images, which showed all these temples which had been not uncovered, just the jungle sucking everything up, and it showed irrigation sites and canals that were unknown at that time, and so these NASA images were like 10 years ago or so. So really, really recent stuff. Great Zimbabwe, biggest city on the coast on the eastern side of Africa. Um, Europeans were so racist that when they encountered Great Zimbabwe, they were like, oh, Black people didn't build this. There's no way that these people in sub-Saharan Africa, this must have been built by like ancient Greeks or something, right? So again, we see just the collapse of major like civilizations, and then just so happens that when like Europeans show up there, right, those were recently abandoned, and so again, all kind of recent emergent studies. The Mongol Empire was very likely collapsed due to the combination of Black Death and climate change, a double whammy. Pacific Islanders. So, what happened in Easter Island? Easter Island became totally isolated. That's probably the best example of that. But we could look at Pacific Islander culture in general. We see these major surge of ocean-going voyages around the 11th century, and Pacific Islanders they're originally Southeast Asians, and they're setting off on these major voyages. They're charting by the stars, just really incredible feats of navigation of the Pacific, and what is, well, you probably know from Moana, wayfinding, but that's a real thing, and it allowed this massive network, this expansion of Pacific Islanders across the Pacific Ocean. And then it looks like climate change that happens caused that network to collapse, which isolated Pacific Islanders. They began to develop only kind of internally with internal contact with each other, no longer able to go back to Southeast Asia and connect with the trade networks there. And so that's very likely, to be the underlying cause of how did Pacific Islander culture emerge, right? But also, again, the similar story with the Americas. Why were the Pacific Islanders not have no immunities to the diseases of Europeans, of Asians, of Africans, the whole Afro-Eurasian trade world? Pacific Islanders have no contact with that either, and so smallpox and other diseases will absolutely devastate them when Europeans show up, Captain Cook, and then other Europeans showing up in the Oceania, Pacific Islander region. Here's a great, very short article, so definitely recommend checking that one out. It looks at the impact of climate change and how that completely changed Pacific Islander voyages or ability to trade network. Okay, so second nadir is in the 16th and 17th century. Sorry, so this now overlaps to more of the history 4 stuff, which is the early modern and modern world history. So again, we have a general crisis in Europe, and again, death and destruction, the expansion of the glaciers, just everything. You've got bread riots because of low-level famines and food shortages. You've got peasant rebellions. You've got witch hunts going on. There's a huge uptick in like burning witches at the stake. People are looking for why are things so bad? There has to be a reason, right? They're looking for scapegoats. They're looking for who can we blame? What is the cause of this? Why are things so bad right now? We also know that We have these what's really interesting about the second nadir point is that we have all this artistic depictions in the 17th century. And it was really like recently that historians started to put that together. Like, wait a second, look at what artists are depicting. They're depicting like the river Thames in London is completely frozen over and people are ice skating on it, right? Like that doesn't happen now. You've got the expansion of the glaciers across Germany and Switzerland. Like this is an image of the Rhone glacier. It's completely overwhelming the valleys in Germany and in Switzerland. There also, again, when you've got problems like that, usually create. Here's more art showing, what's happening in London, and this is near Paris. You have the 30 Years' War. The 30-year war was caused by internal warfare. I mean, it was religiously motivated, like Europeans have been fighting for like the entire Middle Ages, and then the split of the Protestants and Catholics, like one more thing to fight about. But at the surface, this is a religious war, mostly between Catholic and Protestant states or kingdoms. But under the surface is climate change. It's a depletion of resources. It's a decline of agriculture. All of those things are causing states to scramble and to go to war with each other over resources, right? So that's sort of what's happening under the surface. I've got more information here. You can read that. On the flip side, the crisis of the 17th century is going to cause big changes in Europe. We're going to see land reclamation happen very successfully in France and the Netherlands in response to the decline of agriculture. That kind of creates the impetus for changing agricultural methods and what's called land reclamation, meaning like draining swamp areas and then using those regions, which are very fertile and rich, to grow more food or additional food. We've got new crops that come over from the Americas. That's the relation of the Columbian exchange that starts to happen in the 1500s. Europeans accidentally run into the Americas, they discover it, and that leads to the flow of people, germs, ideas, but also like animals and plants and agricultural crops. And so we find that, this is when things like corn and potatoes, peanuts, they're hitting the Eurasian world and having a huge impact because they're great alternative crops, much more secure than say wheat. And so that's going to cause a huge surge of population in Ireland. I also have an image here of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. This is the time period when they start to capitalize on increased agriculture, reorganization of kind of more scientific farming methods. This is almost like a mini second agricultural revolution in some ways, and that's going to allow them to build their capital base, and that will translate into VOC wealth, building huge ships and then taking those into the Indian Ocean trade world and attacking ports and making headway there through force. We'll get to that. Okay, over in Africa, it looks like the effects are even more devastating. Scholars are now arguing that the droughts, the mega droughts of this period, which lasted from about 1450 to 1700 and essentially caused the expansion of the Sahara Desert across what's called the Sahel Belts, which is pictured here in the left image. This is very strongly correlated with the slave trade, and scholars are now arguing, again, this is really recent research, but scholars are now arguing that this is the main cause of the slave trade. And so kind of full details on that in History 4, but it just so happens that the trade networks across the Sahara, the old sand roads or gold roads, those totally collapse, leaving big empires like Mali, which is in here, the western part of of sub-Saharan Africa, huge Mali empire was based on trade wealth that went north, right? Up into North Africa and the Mediterranean world, and then over to the Swahili city-states and out to the Indian Ocean. So all that collapses, all that contact, both with the North and with the East, falls apart, and the Mali empire begins to collapse. And then it just so happens that, Europeans show up on that Western border. Hey, we'll trade with you. We only need labor. That's that's the only thing that we're interested in. We're not interested in your salt. We're not interested in trading, for your gold products. We're not interested in your iron products. We just want bodies because we desperately need labor in the Americas, right? Because remember, they killed everybody with diseases. So the plantation systems start in the 1500s, and Europeans have a massive labor shortage in the Americas. They go, and just so happens that the Mali Empire in Western Africa is just right across the way from the Americas. Here it is. I was thinking, I wish I had a map here. I do. I love it when I outsmart myself. There's the map. So you can see very clearly that the former Mali Empire is directly across from the Caribbean and the coast here where particularly sugar trade begins. So it's the sugar plantations that were incredibly deadly, required enormous amount of labor turnover. And that's the main thing that stimulated the transatlantic slave trade. But it's unlikely that the Mali Empire would have shifted to participating in the slave trade and then themselves collapsing because of it, if they had had any other trade options. So not only did the Mali Empire lose its trade connections, it also lost all of its main sources of agriculture. Millet was the main crop, the storable grain that was being grown in West Africa, and that completely collapsed due to mega droughts. When the slave traders, they also brought alternative crops. So maize or corn. Even more impactful was what in West Africa is known as manioc, which you probably know as cassava. That's the common word in Asia, or in South America, yucca. This is what tapioca is made out of. So that was a very, very sturdy staple crop that grows in really dry, arid climate. And so kind of again, tied into the new trade that's going across the Atlantic. And we can definitely, really recent research, again, like this is just, this really only came out in like 2012. So if you never heard about the little ice age or mega droughts in correlation with the slave trade as like a major cause, it's because it's very recent in terms of historical recognition of that. So you can even calculate, annual rainfall. If there was a 1 degree temperature increase, which meant a little bit more rainfall, then there would be 3,000 less slaves annually being sold in each port. So not only is it correlated with the kind of the big picture of the slave trade, you can even correlate it annually, that in years where things were better, there was a little bit more rainfall, we will see the slave trade decline. And then when there's a pulse in drought, making it even worse a particular year, it spikes. So it's really, really strongly correlated. Okay, here I have just some more resources for you, so you can check out these resources for assignments. If you're writing about the Little Ice Age, these are going to be resources that are going to be useful to you, so just check those out individually. And I'm going to stop the recording here and again let you go through the slides on your own and kind of click those links and poke around a little bit.